Issues related to prostrations of error. 3 to 7 prostrations of error are performed when one unintentionally omits or delays one of the obligatory elements of a prayer, and consists of the 2 prostrations that must be performed at the end of that prayer, along with the Tashahhud, the Salawat, and the supplications. It is performed as follows. After reciting only the Tahiyyat during the final sitting, the salam is given to both directions. Then, by saying Allahu Akbar, one goes in the prostration and recites Subhana Rabbiyal-Ala 3 times. Then, by saying Allahu Akbar, one rises. After a pause of 1 tasbih, Allahu Akbar is said again, and the second prostration is performed. After reciting Subhan Rabbiyal-Ala 3 times, one rises by saying Allahu Akbar and sits down. The Tahiyyat and Salawat are recited, followed by Rabbena Atina, and the salam is given first to the right, then to the left. However, performing the sehi prostrations after giving the salam to the right is more virtuous and in accordance with caution. For this reason, in congregational prayers, to prevent the congregation from dispersing by mistake, it is preferred to perform the prostration of forgetfulness only after giving the salutation to the right side. 328. The prostrations of forgetfulness are obligatory, as is well known. Every prayer, whether obligatory, FARZ, mandatory, VACIB, or sunnah, includes obligatory elements such as recitation, ruku, and sujud, as well as mandatory elements such as reciting the Fatiha, adding a surah, and observing the order. And there are sunnah practices such as reciting salawats during the seats, during the sitting positions, such as reciting the salawat. For this reason, one must observe these points so that the prayer is performed properly. Therefore, whether it is a fard or not, if any part of a prayer is intentionally or inadvertently omitted, that prayer must be performed again. Performing prostrations of forgetfulness is not sufficient to remedy such a major defect. Intentionally omitting or delaying a VACIB is a sign. For this reason, prostrations of forgetfulness are not required. It is appropriate to repeat such a prayer. The inadvertent omission or delay of a mandatory act requires prostrations of forgetfulness. In this way, the deficiency is corrected. The intentional or inadvertent omission of a sunnah does not require the prostrations of forgetfulness. However, intentional omission is a defect. It results in being deprived of reward and merit. According to the Maliki school, the prostrations of forgetfulness are a sunnah. According to the Shafi'i school, they are also a sunnah. However, if the imam performs the prostrations of forgetfulness, it is obligatory for the congregation to follow the imam. According to the Hanbalis, prostrations of forgetfulness are sometimes obligatory, sometimes sunnah, and sometimes permissible. For example, prostrations of forgetfulness performed due to the omission of a sunnah of the prayer are permissible. According to Imam Shafi'i and Imam Ahmad, they are performed before giving the salam to both sides. According to Imam Malik, if the mistake, sehi, is due to an addition, the prostrations of sehi are performed after the salam. If it is due to an omission, or an omission combined with an addition, they are performed before the salutation. This is a matter of preference. Otherwise, all are permissible. 329. Bringing forward or delaying a complete pillar or an obligatory part of a prayer requires the prostration of forgetfulness. This is because such an act of bringing forward or delaying is considered an abandonment of a wajib. An example of this is when, during the standing position qiyam, one goes into ruku after reciting Subhanak, but before reciting the Quranic recitation qira'ah, and then returns to the standing position only after remembering to perform the obligatory recitation. This is an example of such a situation. In this case, the previous ruku is invalid. A new ruku is performed after the recitation, if one returns to standing without reciting and then proceeds to ruku. The prayer is void, because in such a rak'ah, it is obligatory to observe the order among the rukus, which are not repeated like the ruku itself. 330. If one of the two prostrations in a rak'ah is inadvertently omitted and is remembered at the end of the next rak'ah or the final sitting, the prayer does not need to be repeated due to this delay. Rather, that prostration is performed immediately. If IT is remembered while in the final sitting, that prostration is performed. And then that sitting, kata, is repeated. Then the prostrations of error are performed. In this case, the last rak'ah will include 5 prostrations and 3 sittings, because there are 2 prostrations in one rak'ah. Since partially postponing a repeated rukn is not considered abandoning an obligatory act, IT does not require the prayer to be repeated. However, if both prostrations in a rak'ah are incorrectly performed early, that is, if 2 prostrations are done first and ruku is performed afterwards, then, to adhere to the mandatory order, ruku is performed again, followed by the prostrations. Due to these repetitions and corrections, the prostrations of forgetfulness are performed at the end of the prayer. 331. Repeating any of the obligatory parts of a prayer require performing the prostrations of forgetfulness. For example, performing ruku twice or prostrating 3 times in a single rak'ah. The same applies to reciting the Fatiha twice or consecutively in the first and second rak'ats, or reciting the Quran during ruku, prostration, or the Tashahhud. However, reciting the Fatiha twice in the third or fourth rak'ah, or reciting another surah along with the Fatiha in these rak'ahs, or reciting only another surah does not require prostrations of error, because in such a case, a mandatory act has not been omitted or delayed, nor has the Quran been recited in a place other than where it is permissible. However, if in this case the rak'ats are prolonged more than the previous ones and emphasis is placed on the congregation, one is not protected from dislikeness. 332. Omitting an obligatory act out of mistake requires prostrations of forgiveness, such as omitting the first sitting, or the qanut in the witr prayer, or the additional takbirs in the Eid prayers, or failing to recite the Tashahhud in the first and second sittings. If one realizes after ruku in the witr prayer that the qanut dua was forgotten, one does not return to the standing position to recite IT. It is also not required to recite IT after ruku, for its time has passed. Even if it is remembered while in ruku, it is not required to recite it. This is the authentic narration. However, whether IT is recited or not, prostrations of forgetfulness are required in both cases. Forgetting to recite the qanut takbir and not performing IT requires a prostration of forgetfulness according to one opinion, and does not require it according to another. 3.3. Delaying an obligatory act due to a mistake also requires the prostration of forgetfulness. Sitting briefly after the first or third rak'ah, standing up for the 5th rak'ah after the 4th rak'ah, such as standing for a 3rd rak'ah after the 2nd rak'ah of the morning prayer, or standing for a 4th rak'ah after the 3rd rak'ah of the evening prayer, sitting longer than the required amount during the first sitting, kaid, and delaying the standing for the 3rd rak'ah is also of this nature. 3.3.4. Changing the characteristic of a wajib requires a prostration of error, such as the imam reciting verses that should be recited aloud in a low voice, or reciting verses that should be recited in a low voice aloud. The required amount of recitation is just enough to make the prayer valid. Reciting the first verses of Surah Al-Fatiha falls under this category. Additionally, according to Imam Al-Azam, reciting a short verse also falls under this ruling. However, according to 2 other imams, this does not fall under this ruling. The minimum level of reciting aloud is to the extent that another person can hear IT. The minimum level of reciting silently, hafiyan, is to the extent that only the one reciting can hear IT. 335. In a place where recitation is to be done quietly, most of the Fatiha is mistakenly recited aloud. The remainder is still recited quietly. Conversely, if in a prayer to be recited aloud, a part of the Fatiha is recited silently, and then it is intended to be recited aloud, the Fatiha is recited aloud from the beginning, Thus, both audible and silent recitation are not combined in a single rak'ah. However, according to another opinion, the Fatiha is not recited again. Only the remaining portion is recited aloud. 336. According to the preferred opinion, a prostration of forgetfulness is not required if one prays alone, whether reciting aloud or silently. However, if one intentionally recites aloud in a place where recitation is supposed to be silent, such as during the noon prayer, one commits a sign. It is disliked, makruh, for one who prays alone to recite aloud during voluntary prayers performed during the day. 337. If the Imam mistakenly recites Surah Al-Fatiha silently during the morning prayer, and then remembers, he recites the subsequent surah aloud and does not repeat Al-Fatiha. 338. If someone has begun a prayer in congregation where the Quran is to be recited aloud and has recited the Fatiha silently, and another person comes and joins him, if that person wishes to act as the Imam, they should recite the surah aloud. If they do not wish to, they are not required to recite it aloud. 339. Regarding the situation of one who, in an obligatory prayer, fails to sit after the second rak'ah and mistakenly attempts to stand for the third rak'ah, if the attempt to stand is close to sitting, they sit, and no prostration of forgetfulness is required. However, if their standing is close to the standing position, they stand up and then perform the prostration of forgetfulness, because in this case, the obligatory first sitting has been omitted. However, according to another narration, if the person praying has not yet fully stood up, they return to the sitting position and do not omit the obligatory act. If they return to the seat after the Imam has fully stood up and risen, the prayer is void, because in this case, the obligatory standing position has been invalidated, and the order of the prayer has been completely altered, according to another opinion. In this case, the prayer is not invalidated, but one has committed a sign and prostrations of error as required. 340. If, during the third rak'ah of a sunnah prayer, one realizes that the Tashahhud was not recited after the second rak'ah, the following applies. If this third rak'ah has not yet been connected to the prostration, one returns to the sitting position. If it has been connected to the prostration, one does not return, according to another opinion, regardless of whether it is connected to prostration or not. One does not return to the sitting position. In both cases, prostrations of forgetfulness must be performed. 341. In 4 rak'ah obligatory prayers, if one stands up for the 5th rak'ah without performing the second sitting, one must return to the sitting position until the prostration for the 5th rak'ah has been performed. After the Tashahhud, the salam is given and the prostrations of forgetfulness are performed, because the obligatory final sitting has been delayed. This delay, however, is considered a neglect of a VACIB. However, if the prostration for the 5th rak'ah has already been performed, this prayer becomes a nafil. Another rak'ah is then added, and a 6 rak'ah supererogatory prayer is performed. According to the correct opinion, a prostration of forgetfulness is not required in this case. This is the view of Imam Azam and Imam Abu Yusuf. According to Imam Muhammad, if one rises from the prostration of the 5th rak'ah, the prayer is completely invalid. 342. If during the final sitting of a 4 rak'ah obligatory prayer, one mistakenly stands up without giving the salam, one should immediately return to the sitting position, give the salam, and perform the prostration of forgetfulness. However, if one has already proceeded to prostration for the 5th rak'ah, an additional rak'ah is added to it. In this case, the obligatory prayer is completed with the previous 4 rak'ahs, and the other 2 rak'ahs are considered supererogatory. Prostrations of error are also performed as a matter of judicial discretion. This ruling also applies to rising for a 4th rak'ah after the second sitting in the evening prayer, and for a 3rd rak'ah after the sitting in the morning prayer. Therefore, the 2 additional rak'ahs added to these prayers are considered supererogatory. Since these actions are not performed intentionally, they are not considered disliked. This is the preferred opinion. 343 IN Fard and video prayers of 4 OR 3 rakats. If one mistakenly says, Allahum salli ala Muhammadin ve ala ali Muhammad, according to a narration from Imam Azam, adding even a single letter after this tashahhud requires the prostration of forgetfulness. However, reciting the Quran or making dua after the tashahhud in the final sittings does not require prostrations of error, for this sitting is a place for dua and praise. Quran itself encompasses both prayer and praise, reciting dhikr, prayers, and the tashahhud, Tahiyyat, aloud during prayer also does not require prostrations of error. 344 intentionally remaining silent and failing to recite the Fatiha or another surah during the third and fourth rakats of obligatory prayers is a mistake. However, it does not require prostrations of error. If one remains silent by mistake and fails to recite the Fatiha or another surah, it requires the prostration of forgetfulness. According to Imam Abu Yusuf, prostrations of forgetfulness must be performed in both cases. 345. If one becomes so absorbed in thought during prayer that one misses a pillar. Iftida, takbir, even if one thinks, did I recite the takbir or not? And then later remembers that the takbir was recited. Or if one assumes it was not recited and therefore recites another takbir, a prostration of forgetfulness is required. Again, if one continually doubts whether one has prayed 3 or 4 rakats, or if one pauses to consider which surah to recite after the Fatiha, prostrations of forgetfulness are still required, because in these situations, a VACIB has been delayed. However, a moment of distraction or thought that occurs while performing a rukn or a VACIB does not require prostrations of forgetfulness. Praying with complete peace of mind is not a virtue granted to everyone. 346. If a person doubts the number of rakas in a prayer they have performed, the following applies. If this doubt has occurred for the first time in their life, they must repeat that prayer. However, if it has happened a few times, they investigate and render a judgment according to their conviction. It is not necessary to pray it again. The testimony of the heart is sufficient in such an investigation. Example, if one doubts while performing the morning prayer, wondering, did I pray 1 rakah or 2? And then concludes in one's heart that one prayed 1 rakah, one should add another rakah as a precaution. Due to such doubts, one performs the prostrations of forgetfulness. On the other hand, if one concludes that one has performed 2 rakats, one remains seated. After the tashahhud and salam, one performs the prostrations of forgetfulness. If he cannot decide between the two, he takes the smaller number as the basis. For there is certainty in the smaller number. In this case, he performs 1 more rakah. However, in this case, he sits down at the end of the rakah he is uncertain about. Then he stands up and performs that 1 rakah, because there is a possibility that he had already performed 2 rakahs. In this case as well, he performs the prostrations of forgetfulness at the end of the prayer. 347. If someone has begun a 4 rakah prayer and is unsure whether the rakah they have performed is the first or the second, if they are unsure and cannot decide which one it is, they should consider themselves to have prayed 1 rakah and, as a precaution, sit for the duration of the tashahhud at the end of each rakah. In this way, the qada will have been performed 4 times, because there is a possibility that the first counted rakah is actually the second, and the third counted rakah is actually the fourth. 348. If a person is uncertain whether the rakah they are performing is the second or the third, according to the correct opinion, they do not sit at the end of that rakah. If they cannot decide which one it is, they count it as the second rakah and complete the remaining rakahs. The evening prayer and the video prayer are exceptions to this rule. If this doubt arises in either of these prayers, one must sit down. This is because it is likely that the rakah in question is the third rakah. In this case, an additional rakah is performed after the tashahhud. This is because it is also possible that the rak'ah in question is the second rak'ah. Prostrations of error are then performed at the end of these. 349. In 4 rak'ah prayers, when it is uncertain whether the performed rak'ah is the 4th or the 5th, and in the morning prayer when it is uncertain whether the performed rak'ah is the 2nd or the 3rd, and in the evening and dhikr prayers, when there is doubt as to whether the current rak'ah is the 3rd or the 4th, one should sit down at the end, stand up after the tashahhud, and perform one more rak'ah. This is because it is possible that these rak'ats are the 3rd, 4th, or 5th rak'ah. Therefore, the extra rak'at added will be considered a supererogatory prayer. Finally, the prostrations of doubt are performed. This doubt depends on whether it arose during the standing position, the bowing position, or the transition from bowing to standing. If the doubt arises after the first prostration has been performed, the prayer is unanimously invalid. This is because it is likely that the rak'ah in question was extra and that the final sitting was omitted. If doubt arises during the first prostration, according to Imam Muhammad alone, the prayer is not invalid. 350. If during prayer, even a single letter of another surah is mistakenly recited before the Fatiha, the prayer is repeated by first reciting the Fatiha and then that surah. The prostrations of forgetfulness are also performed at the end of the prayer. If this mistake is realized even while in the state of ruku, one must return to the standing position and repeat the part. Such a mistake does not occur often. Therefore, even a small amount of it cannot be forgiven. However, if one intends to recite the surah below the one currently being recited, but accidentally recites the one above it, prostrations of error are not required. 351. If a person doubts whether they recited the Fatiha during prayer, the following applies. If they have not yet recited another surah, they should recite the Fatiha. However, if they have already recited another surah, they should not recite the Fatiha, because it is clear that the surah is recited after the Fatiha. However, if the person praying has a particular opinion, they act accordingly. 352. If a person, after going into prostration, realizes that they did not recite the Fatiha in the first rak'ahs despite having recited the surah in each, they do not repeat the Fatiha in the final rak'ahs, because the Fatiha will be recited in the last rak'ahs anyway. Reciting 2 Fatihas in a single rak'ah, however, is not permissible. However, according to Hazan ibn Ziyad, the Fatiha is made up in the last rak'ah letters TS 353 if, in the first 2 rak'ahs of 4 or 3 rak'ah obligatory prayers, no surah or portion of a surah is recited after the Fatiha, and these surahs or verses are added after the Fatiha in the 3rd and 4th rak'ahs. If they are added after the Fatiha in the 3rd and 4th rak'ahs, and if this prayer is an evening or night prayer performed in congregation, both the Fatiha and the surah to be added are recited aloud in the 3rd and 4th rak'ahs, because the recitation in a single standing position is one. It cannot be recited partly in a whisper and partly aloud. However, some scholars state that only the surah should be recited aloud. According to Imam Abu Yusuf, both are recited silently, for it is sunnah to recite silently in the last rak'ah letters T. According to another narration from Imam Abu Yusuf, this surah is nitrogen monoxide longer recited in the last rak'ahs because its time has passed. However, in any case, the prostrations of error are performed. 354. The Imam's error requires the prostrations of error both for himself and for the congregation, as he has followed their lead. However, if a member of the congregation following the Imam makes a mistake, neither he nor the Imam is required to perform prostrations of error. 355. It is valid to follow an Imam who is performing prostrations of error. This applies equally whether it is during any of the prostrations of forgetfulness or during the Tashahhud. One who follows the Imam in the second prostration of the prostrations of forgetfulness does not need to make up the first prostration. and one who follows him in the Tashahhud does not need to make up both prostrations. 356. The latecomer performs the prostrations of forgetfulness together with the Imam. The ruling remains the same, even if the Imam's error occurs before the follower begins to follow him, because the follower is bound to the Imam. If the person joining the prayer stands up before the Imam, has given the salam during the Tashahhud, and then performs the recitation or goes into ruku, and the Imam then gives the salam and proceeds to the prostration of forgetfulness, the follower immediately follows these prostrations and omits the recitation and ruku he had previously performed, performing these actions later by standing up again. However, if the follower does not follow the Imam in these prostrations, his prayer is not invalidated. After finishing the prayer, he performs these prostrations of error on his own. Again, if the latecomer has already reached the prostration and the Imam is about to perform the prostrations of error, he does not follow the Imam. He finishes his prayer and then performs the prostrations of error. If he were to follow the Imam in this situation, his prayer would be invalidated. 357. If a latecomer stands up to complete the remaining rakas after the Imam is given the salam and makes a mistake in those rakas, he must perform the prostrations of forgetfulness. This ruling remains the same, even if the lagger had already performed the prostrations of error with the Imam, because, while completing the missing rekha letters TS, the late joiner is considered to be praying alone. 358. If the late joiner gives the salam along with the Imam by mistake, he is not required to perform the prostrations of error. However, if he gives the salam after the Imam's salam, it requires a prostration of error, because in the first case, he is still a follower, but in the second case, he has become a solo worshipper, one who prays alone. A follower muqtadi is not required to perform the prostration of forgetfulness due to his own mistake. 359. If there are several mistakes in a single prayer, it is not necessary to perform that many prostrations of forgetfulness. It is sufficient to perform the prostrations of forgetfulness once for all of them. Therefore, if a person makes a mistake 2 or 3 times during a prayer, it is sufficient to perform the prostration of forgiveness only once at the end of the prayer. A single mistake in the prostrations of forgetfulness does not require additional prostrations of forgetfulness. 360. If the prostrations of forgetfulness are intentionally or accidentally omitted, they are still performed unless a situation contrary to prayer arises. However, if a situation contrary to prayer occurs, such as laughing or speaking after the Tashahhud, or if the time of disliked acts begins, the prostrations of forgetfulness are void, such as the sun rising after the salam in the morning prayer, or the sun's dimming and losing its glare, changing after the salam in the afternoon prayer. 361. If an imam omits the prostration of forgetfulness, the congregation also omits it. In Friday and Eid prayers, these prostrations of forgetfulness are omitted to avoid confusion due to the large crowd. 362. The 2 prostrations of the prostration of forgetfulness, along with the Tashahhud and the Salam, are obligatory. Reciting the Salawat and supplication after the Tashahhud, the takbirs during these prostrations, the recitation of the tasbih while in prostration, and the sitting between the 2 prostrations are sunnah. 363. If a person is absolutely certain that he has performed his prayer completely, but a trustworthy man informs him that he has performed it incompletely, he does not accept this statement. However, one should follow the report of 2 trustworthy men, for such a report constitutes a situation whose truth is established by the testimony of 2 people. Such a report is valid and binding in many places. If the imam and the congregation disagree, if the imam has certainty, he does not act upon the congregation's words. If he lacks certainty, he accepts the congregation's words.